husband let me sleep with other men, but he found someone new immediately. Now I'm alone. Hello, Reddit. My name is Sarah, and I'm in really big trouble. My husband is now dating his secretary, and I am very jealous because he does not have time for me anymore. He was the one who suggested the whole stupid thing in the first place, and now I regret it so badly. And I don't know how to get my man back, especially because he's always with her. Well, the thing is, my husband let me sleep with other men, but then he found someone else, and now I'm alone. And I can't even bring myself to tell him I was wrong. Before you go on blaming me, hear me out first. I met Peter, my husband, back when I worked as his secretary in his company, and we had a good working relationship for close to 2 years. But eventually, Peter got interested in me and started wooing me, and from there, things kicked off. I've been married to Peter for about 12 years now, and we have 2 kids, a boy and a girl. When Peter and I started dating, I decided to quit so that it wouldn't be a case of nepotism. We dated for 2 years before Peter finally asked me to marry him, and of course I said yes. I had been so in love with Peter then, and I still am now, really, which is why I really want to get him back. I got pregnant 3 months into our marriage, and Peter had been so happy. I was too, but I just had some doubts, though I never told Peter about them. I guess he had guessed and probably thought it was just a new mother's nerves about the baby, and he reassured me a lot. But then again, he couldn't guess why I had serious doubts about having the baby, so I let him believe it had been new mother nerves. When we gave birth to our first child, Sam, Peter had been so happy, but somehow I just wasn't. I wanted my baby, and I knew I loved my baby immediately when I set my eyes on him, but I just hadn't been happy. I couldn't explain to Peter or anyone else why I felt that way, so of course I didn't let it show because it would be absurd for a woman not to be happy she was now a mother. By the time Sam was a year old, I got pregnant again, this time with a girl, Dora. I plummeted deeper into depression after finding out I was pregnant. Peter did not know all this because, in front of him, I pretended to be happy and satisfied, but I knew I wasn't. I went to the hospital to get some antidepressant pills, but I wasn't given a prescription because I had been obviously pregnant. That frustrated me a lot. Peter found out about my depression, though, because the doctor called him to inform him about my condition and how he could help manage it. Peter had been so upset and disappointed because he hadn't been able to guess I was going through all that. The truth about my depression had nothing to do with my husband or my babies, but because of the fact that I had made one mistake, and I knew that it would probably end my marriage if my husband ever found out. While we were dating, I had actually been with another man. It wasn't like I was exactly dating him. It had been a fling, really. You know that saying about not putting your eggs in one basket? That was exactly what I thought and did. I loved Peter very much, but I hadn't thought we would end up married. Of course, I wanted that, but I hadn't wanted to be disappointed and heartbroken in the end. I knew what that did to my Aunt Amelia. She had been in love with one man for most of her life, and when he left her because he had supposedly found someone new and couldn't be with her because she was ugly, Aunt Amelia never got over it, even until now. She stays with my parents at their place so they can keep an eye on her and prevent her from overdosing on depression pills, like she did the last time she had been alone in her apartment, and had almost died. So I had not wanted that for myself. But I was depressed because I didn't know who my first baby belonged to. I didn't want to do a DNA test so that my husband wouldn't suspect anything. I had started dating the other guy after I met Peter. Not exactly dating, we were mostly too busy for each other, so when we met, it was only to have sex. And I did have sex with him again after getting married. But that had been once, and I did too with my husband, so I couldn't tell exactly who the father was. As I watched my son grow, I began to panic when at first he looked nothing like Peter. But eventually he looked more and more like Peter, and that strong resemblance reassured me about who the father of the baby was. When our kids were 7 and 6, respectively, I decided to go back to work, but not as Peter's secretary, because that just wouldn't work. He had employed another secretary over the years, so it would be wicked of me to take someone else's job just because I wanted to go back there. I decided to start up a small business. I loved books so much. Whenever I started reading, I got so lost in them. One time I had been cooking and decided to read a book to pass the time while waiting for the food to be ready. But I forgot I had been cooking because, as per usual, I got lost in my book. The kitchen almost caught fire, and thank God Peter had come home when he did because he was the one who put out the fire. So I decided to build up a shop where I could sell books and where people could borrow books or even read there too. It was like a mini library, and Peter supported me financially. Staying in my bookshop was more fun for me than working anywhere else because I got the chance to do what I loved the most, which was reading. I only got distracted whenever a customer came in, and when they were done, I returned back to my books. There was one novel that caught my eye, though, and I think it messed up my thinking. Well, not exactly, but I guess I could say it had been the way I interpreted the whole thing. I had seen it and bought it on impulse when I went to get some new sets of books. The title had been How to Spice Up Your Marriage, and I had been curious about it. I read the book over and over again for a week, and that began to develop some weird reasoning. The writer had pinpointed that if you were already bored in your marriage, you'd try to spice things up and not wait around to see if things would go back to the way they once were, and that you should try new things with your husband to get him interested in you. She talked about getting your partner a gift randomly. So the first thing that I did was get my husband a gift. He had been surprised because I only did that when we had special occasions, and we didn't have any that day. So when he asked where I got the money because the gift was quite expensive, and my husband knew I didn't make much from the bookstore. I'd been upset when he kept pestering me to tell him how I got the money for the gift. It had actually been his own money, but he'd never know that. My husband had a safe beside our bed where he kept what he called emergency money. Since I knew the password, it was easy to take a little from the money, and I knew my husband would never notice because he just kept putting money there without actually counting. But I had a key to open the safe, and he had 2 extra keys for the safe. So I took the amount that pleased me and went and got the gift. But Peter just annoyed me when he kept asking me where I got the money. So that particular piece of advice about getting your partner a gift hadn't worked for me. I had just left for our bedroom and went to sleep. The next morning, Peter apologized and I forgave him, but I never really forgot about it. It still annoys me whenever I think about it. By the time our marriage was a little over 10 years, I was bored out of my mind because my marriage had become equally boring. Peter, over the years, became busier with his work, and he would sometimes spend 3 to 4 days working. So when he got home, he would be so tired and hungry that he'd just eat and then sleep off. Our marriage made me feel like I was a tenant in it, and that usually upset me. I felt like he no longer needed or loved me, and I thought it was probably because my body did not lose the fat I gained while I was pregnant. I felt he was disgusted by that, and it really made me unhappy. I went back to my book again to get more advice. The writer mentioned again about being so sexy that your husband would not want to have anyone but you. So I started exercising and dieting hard. One time I fainted because I had not eaten anything good for some weeks. Peter got angry with me for doing what he knew I wasn't strong enough to handle, and he reassured me that he loved my body the way it was and would never do anything to hurt me or our kids. I settled down again and was once more the happy wife because Peter finally cut down his workload, reassigning some of his staff to do most of the work. He started spending more time at home with the kids and me. Soon, Peter and I started having issues at home, and I was usually the one picking fights. It was either I was tracking his movements or telling him to refuse female clients. That frustrated Peter so much, but I just did not want him cheating on me. Call it being paranoid, but I wanted him all to myself, even though I did cheat on him years ago. Soon I met a friend of mine from high school. She had come to settle in our town because she had been transferred for work, and her boyfriend relocated with her since he did mostly remote jobs. Sonia and I started meeting up, and we would talk about everything and anything. It was wonderful for me, having someone to talk to, especially because I was usually bored out of my mind most times when the kids and Peter weren't around. Even my books couldn't always make me happy. So it was lovely meeting her because we got to have that girl time that I never really had before. When I confessed to Sonia about what was happening in my marriage, Sonia suggested spicing things up. My mind went back to the book I had taken advice from, and I expected her to say something straight out of it. But surprisingly, she told me that she and her boyfriend used to have arguments like that all the time until they decided to open up their relationship. And now they haven't had arguments in a year. I was surprised they were both cool with seeing someone else while being together. I remembered how bothered I had been about cheating on Peter with another man, and how scared I was when I doubted the paternity of Sam. When I asked her what she would do if she got pregnant for the other person she was seeing, she told me she was always safe and didn't need children yet. Our conversation stayed in my head for days, and I wondered how exactly I was going to tell Peter that I wanted us to have an open marriage. Peter knew I was bothered by something and tried hard to get me to open up, but I was too scared to say anything. I decided that since I was the one who wasn't comfortable in our marriage, I needed to get a man on the side with or without Peter knowing. I know, I somehow just wanted to delude myself into thinking it was the right reason to cheat. But that's how I met Adam. Adam was a student at a college close to my bookshop. He came into my bookshop that day looking for a particular book, and I hadn't noticed when he walked in because I was engrossed in one of the books I had just gotten my hands on. He took a peek at the book in my hand, which startled me, but he immediately struck up a conversation with me about it. I found the conversation both intriguing and refreshing because I hadn't had a chance to argue about books with anyone. Peter usually just agreed with anything I said because he wasn't much of a fan of books besides documents and manuscripts. We talked for a long time, and when he eventually had to leave, he promised to return soon. It was after he left that I realized I hadn't even gotten his name or number, but I held on excitedly to the promise that he would come back soon. Normally, I usually close the shop for 2 days a week, on Sundays and Wednesdays, but this time, I did not in hopes of seeing him again. I was surprisingly disappointed when he didn't show up after 2 weeks, so I eventually tried to forget about him. One Sunday, when I had forgotten a book I was reading at the bookshop, I left the kids with their dad so I could pick it up, and I saw Adam walking right toward me. I remember my heart beating so fast that I was surprised he didn't hear it too. I was excited to see him again, and I knew I was beginning to like him beyond just liking him because of his interest in books. I found out his name that day, and he even took my contact, and we started texting. At first, it was about books. Whenever I got a new batch of books I thought he'd be interested in, I told him, and whenever he read them, he'd send me reviews. I usually posted these reviews in front of the bookshelves so people, not knowing what kinds of books to get, would become interested based on those reviews. Adam was the one who suggested I do that, and it actually helped me sell more books than I had ever sold since opening up the bookshop, and I was really happy. Whenever Adam came around to my bookshop, I always gave him a discount on any book he bought. I knew he was only helping me sell the books without asking for anything in return, which was why I gave him a discount on everything he bought. My affection for Adam grew by the day, and my feelings bothered me because not only was he younger than me by 10 years, but I was also married with kids. Adam seemed to like me too, despite our age differences and knowing that I was a married woman. I eventually decided to turn Adam away and cut off our connection because I did not want any trouble, despite deciding to spice up my marriage in my head. I felt like Adam was too young to get involved with, so I started by not replying to his texts, and when he came around to my bookshop, I pretended to be busy with other things. It affected me badly, treating him like that, especially because I liked him too, but I had to do it for both of us. Adam eventually gave up after trying for a month to get me to tell him why I was avoiding him. It hurt me, but I knew I had no choice. A while after the whole thing with Adam, my husband and I decided that for summer break, we were sending the kids to their grandparents to enjoy the holiday while we stayed back and had fun. I was so happy we decided to do that because it meant we were going the extra mile to make our marriage more meaningful and less boring. I even bought sexy lingerie and had spa treatments in preparation for the holiday. When it finally came, we had already decided that Peter would drop the kids off at their grandparents and spend a day before returning to make sure the kids were comfortable and to explain their routines to their grandparents. I was supposed to be the one traveling with them, but I couldn't drive that well. I mean, I could drive some distance, but not that far, so Peter had to take on that job. The day he was supposed to return, I estimated his journey would take roughly 5 hours, so I prepared everything in advance. Dinner, candlelight, roses in our bedroom. Actually, through the help of a professional, I can't do any sort of decoration to save my life. When I estimated that he would be home in 30 minutes, I quickly showered, put on my lingerie, and waited patiently for my husband to show up. But he never did. Not that night. I waited for 2 hours before I started panicking that something had gone wrong, and when I called him, he told me he had to make an emergency work trip because one of his workshops had exploded, and they had casualties. He apologized for not having called to inform me earlier because he had been disoriented upon hearing the news. I felt disturbed for the people who got injured, and all my anger left my system. But then again, I became frustrated. It was like nothing ever seemed to go my way. And right then and there, I was determined that after Peter came back from his trip, I was going to tell him I wanted an open marriage. Okay. Peter was gone for 2 months, and I knew how rough it was for me. He called every night to check on me, and he always sounded so tired and stressed out. It broke my heart hearing him sound that way. After the end of 2 long months when Peter was supposed to be back, he couldn't come home because he was pulled into a court matter when the families of the casualties agreed to sue him for negligence. It took another 5 months before Peter was able to sort everything out and come home. But during those 5 months, a lot had happened. I met a guy named John. John had been another high school friend of mine, and we reconnected at a reunion party. It was actually Sonia who decided to host the party and invited many of our friends. The party had been wonderful. Everything was provided for, the drinks, the food, and the restaurant was booked for us alone. I knew Sonia's boyfriend was quite rich, but I didn't know to what extent. Seeing her spend money like that, I felt quite envious. Not because Peter didn't give me money whenever I asked, but I knew I couldn't spend the way Sonia did because I had kids to think of, along with my responsibilities toward my parents and siblings. But for that one time, I wanted to spoil myself, to spend money without caring about the world's opinion or the responsibilities that had become tiring. At the party, we caught up on what we had missed in each other's lives. Some were married like I was, some were still single, some were working for companies, and others owned their own businesses. It had been fun, and John had approached me when I stepped out onto the balcony to receive a call from Peter, who wanted to check up on me to see how I was doing and how the party was going. I hadn't seen John until after I ended the call, and I almost yelped when I finally did. He started talking about different things, most of which I don't even remember. But one part that surprised me was when he mentioned he had always had a crush on me in high school. I had been so surprised because back in high school, John had been the shy type who never spoke much. We weren't friends back then because of how timid he was and how outspoken I was. I guess you could say our characters clashed. He collected my contact information and promised to call or text me the next day. The next day came, and I found myself waiting for his text or call, but it never came. The only text I received that day was from Peter, telling me he wished he could call, but it was late, and he was so exhausted that he would have probably fallen asleep halfway through the call. He also said he loved me. The next morning, it was my phone's ringtone that startled me awake, and when I picked up, it was John. He apologized for not keeping his promise of calling the day before and said he was just making sure I had given him the correct number. We spoke for about 10 minutes before ending the call. I got up feeling rather excited, quickly prepared breakfast for the kids, and packed their lunch. Then I woke them up to get ready for school. After I was done, I drove them to school before heading to the bookshop. I was surprised to hear my phone beep with a message from Adam. He texted to ask how I was doing and if I was done avoiding him because he missed me. I didn't know at that time that Adam would ever speak to me again after the brutal way I had shut him out of my life. I was still thinking of ways to get rid of Adam again when John's call came in, asking for directions to my bookshop. After I gave him the directions, he showed up in 30 minutes, saying he had come for a work trip and remembered me mentioning my bookshop, which is why he called to get the address. We spoke for quite some time before he had to leave, and he promised to call me again that evening. He kept his promise, and we continued talking and laughing about different things on the phone. Within a week of reconnecting, John and I started having an affair. In my mind, I thought that since I had already planned on telling Peter about the open marriage, I could go ahead with John as much as I wanted. Whenever I was hit by guilt, I waved it off. Adam didn't stop pestering me either, telling me not about books this time, but about his feelings. I still liked him too, but I also liked John, and I didn't know how to handle it all. Until a ridiculous idea formed in my head. I decided to date them both, since neither knew the other. I did. I started having affairs with both of them because, in some weird way, the excitement of dating two different men, one my age and one younger, while still having a husband thrilled me. I continued the affairs with both, ensuring neither found out about the other. It was easy for a while, except that Adam became clingy. Despite my telling him to keep everything low-key, he kept trying to mark his territory with outrageous actions, which annoyed me. One time, he walked into my bookshop like he owned it, came over and kissed me on the lips. The crazy thing was, there were customers in the shop who saw him do it. I was furious and didn't speak to him for days, even when he came under the pretense of buying books just to apologize. I eventually forgave him after giving him strict warnings about what not to do, especially in public, and he agreed. John was different, very easy to handle. We both knew what we wanted and never tried to make our affair public. I guess him being married himself helped us understand the responsibility of keeping our relationship secret. Adam, however, was a different case entirely. He was younger and wanted to explore everything together, including sex, which was the only thing I wanted from him. But he didn't understand that and just wanted to claim me. I knew I had to end things with Adam if I didn't want Peter finding out, especially since Adam was becoming bolder in his behavior. Peter finally came back from his long trip and I began to panic. Every day during those last 7 months, I had decided how I was going to tell him about the open marriage, but I couldn't find a way to do it without sounding offensive or like the cheating spouse I was. And because Adam was getting too difficult to handle with how much space he took up in my life, I eventually threatened to end things with him if he didn't stop pestering me. Adam was surprised I threatened to end the relationship, but was also scared I meant it, so he toned down his caveman behavior around me. But who said having two different affairs with two different men while having a husband was easy? Despite John and Adam agreeing to my plans for when we would meet, it was still difficult playing the perfect wife and mother to Peter and the kids while having not one but two affairs. It was quite hard managing both men, especially since all three of them didn't know about the others. I got the idea to close the shop whenever I wanted to see them, but that plan went out the window when Peter came by one afternoon to pick me up for lunch, only to find the shop locked because I had been with John that day. When Peter asked why I didn't open the shop anymore, I lied and said it was because Sonia had been very sick and had no one to take care of her, so I had to help her out. My husband believed me. So I canceled the plans of locking the shop and instead employed someone to stay there at all times, and that plan worked pretty well for some time. Until somehow Adam found out I was also seeing John. He had furiously walked into my shop and forced the door closed with such force I thought it would come off its hinges. He accused me of cheating on him, and I quietly led him to a quieter spot in my shop so we could talk without the girl I employed knowing what we were discussing. He started the same accusation again, and I snapped, telling him that the only person I had actually been cheating on was my husband, not him or even John. That made him angrier, and he stormed out of my shop, never to return. Later, I realized he had blocked me on every means of communication, and it somehow relieved me. So finally, I decided to tell Peter about my decision to have an open marriage. In fact, that day, I made his favorite food, bought new sets of lingerie that I wore under my skimpy nightwear, and bought scented candles on my way back from work to use in the dining setting. It was the weekend, and luckily the kids had been invited to a sleepover, so it worked out perfectly, except it did not. Peter was quite surprised when he saw all I had done. He took a shower before coming to eat, and halfway through the meal he came for me, and we had sex that evening. While we lay in each other's arms, still basking in the afterglow, I started the conversation I had wanted to have for the longest time. I began by telling him about Sonia's relationship with her boyfriend and how happy they were. Then I went ahead to suggest an open marriage between us. Peter stayed quiet, listening, and the only movement he made was when his hand tightened around me as I mentioned I wanted an open marriage. I was scared of his reaction, so I kept talking, mentioning things I should never have revealed, spilling all the details about John and Adam to him and how exciting it was for me and all. Peter eventually got up, shrugged, and agreed that I could have multiple partners, saying it was cool with him. I was so happy, thinking I could finally relax. Well, except 2 weeks later, Peter brought home his secretary, and I wondered why she was there. Peter then announced that he was seeing her and appreciated me suggesting an open marriage because it meant we didn't have to deal with a dreadful divorce or fight over custody of the kids. I was so shocked and didn't know what to say because I never expected that from Peter. At first, I thought he was using it to spite me for some kind of revenge, but later I realized it was true, his affair with his secretary. Now he barely has time for me. He's not even interested in having sex with me at all. He is only interested in his secretary, and they are always together. I feel pained and annoyed, and now I don't even want an open marriage anymore. I just want my husband back the way he was before. Even the kids have started to notice something is wrong between their father and me, and it hasn't been easy. Try explaining to your children that you had an affair, and now their father is doing the same. It's been exhausting these past few weeks, which is why I'm here, guys. Please help me out. What do you think I can do to make my husband see me again? Message from a desperate wife losing her husband too fast. Update. Hello, Reddit. It's been the most dreadful 3 months. I feel so horrible and even more disgusted with myself. You guys have definitely made me realize just how stupid I was. The painful part is that it took your insults and backlashes to even make me realize that. I wish you could forgive me for what I did, even though I know how impossible that is. The most painful thing is that Peter removed every trace of me from our bedroom and dumped everything in the guest room. Now all I can do is stare at the dull color on the walls and cry myself to sleep. Most times when he brings his mistress home, I hide. But still, their voices, their laughter, manage to travel the long distance to my room. It hurts so badly, watching the man you love slip through your fingers, knowing it's totally your fault. I feel really hopeless now. I hardly go to the bookshop anymore because I'm always too tired from crying all night. This time, Not even books can take me into fantasy land anymore. The only fantasy I wish for is having my husband back, just as he was before. Does anyone happen to have a time machine I could borrow? I'd pay anything to turn back the hands of time to the beginning so that things wouldn't have turned out like this.